Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Ransomware Impact on Large Global Enterprises, sponsored by Vectra. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Matt Bromley, SANS Analyst, and Kevin Kennedy, Senior Vice President of Products at Vectra. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Awesome. Perfect timing. Thank you so much, Carol. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. Super excited to have you here today. Very excited as well to be joined by Kevin over at Vectra. This is our second Spotlight paper webcast. Or sorry, let me rephrase. This is our second Spotlight paper that we did over the course of this month. And this is our second webcast introducing this as well. Just a quick recap, and I'll find a link and throw it into the chat later on as well. Our first one was talking about cloud native ransomware. We did that a few weeks ago, I think, Kevin. That was with some folks over at Vectra. We talked about how ransomware threat actors are actively targeting cloud environments and what the differences look like there versus traditional on-prem ransomware, if you will. And then today's webcast and the associated Spotlight paper, a link of which just hit the chat. So perfect. Thanks, Carol. That was perfect timing. Today's focus is ransomware impact on large global enterprises. And I am joined here today with Kevin Kennedy over at Vectra. Kevin, thanks for being here. You're on mute still, but oh, perfect. There you are. How you doing?
There we go. Good morning. Great to be with you again, Matt. And thanks everyone for joining. Look forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Well, speaking of the conversation, here's how today's going to work. For anyone who may have caught our previous webcast, our previous Spotlight webcast with Vectra team, I'm going to spend a few moments, maybe 20 minutes or so, talking about the paper that we put together. Had a lot of fun bringing this one together. I think it takes a really unique vantage point towards ransomware and its impact. And then Kevin and I are going to get back and forth into sort of a panel discussion. But when I say panel, I don't want it to just be the two of us. For those of you watching this, the Q&A window is wide open, and I highly recommend you use that. And please submit your feedback. Please submit your questions, whatever it may be, to Kevin and myself, and we'll see if we can tackle those questions. We do have some key questions from the paper itself lined up, but we would love to hear what you have to say or any thoughts you may have. We'd also love to hear your thoughts on our conversation back and forth as well. Putting this paper together, and I'll give a little bit of history before I dive into it maybe. When Kevin and I first talked and started putting this together, I think it was a while ago, Kevin, because I remember our first conversation. I remember being in sweatpants, and I live in Texas, so we haven't worn sweatpants in a while. So it's been a little warm down here. So I think it may have been a little bit we started talking about this. But interestingly enough, our conversation started out with how does ransomware impact the largest organizations out there? I think, Kevin, our initial scope, if you will, was the G2K, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Our initial scope was the G2K, the 2,000 largest organizations in the world. And our focus there was to really kind of take the viewpoint of, look, it's really easy, especially for all of us in the security community, to say ransomware is this devastating attack, this, monumental thing that can just completely decimate businesses and destroy data and ruin reputations and crash stock prices and do all those things and whatnot. And it's really easy at a high level to say all of that. But let's be very clear. If you're a multinational organization and you spend millions, hundreds of millions on a security department, your impact of ransomware is going to be a little bit different than a small mom and pop, grocery store that may have 5-6 systems in it. The impact is going to be a little bit different there. First off, I think the impact is going to be a lot more devastating to the latter than the former, but it also guides the direction of the former as well. And that's what we want to focus on is, hey, ransomware is now a thing. You all have heard me say on multiple webcasts, I remember when ransomware was this tiny little nuisance threat that cost like $500 and it was done. And now it's this multi-billion-dollar business where we've got like multiple middlemen and ransomware as a service and ransomware groups fighting amongst each other. And I read the other day about a ransomware bug bounty and this kind of stuff. Like, it is just an endless field of it's its own industry now. Well, big business does very well by observing its adversarial industries and reacting accordingly. And that's what we wanted to capture in this today. Ransomware is now a big thing, makes a lot of money. What is the impact on large global enterprises? Now, I want to offer one other little tidbit in here. We did not capture this in the report because I don't think any information was released. Kevin, did you see in the past couple of days, there was an announcement about some of those crypto hacks being, I think, attributed back to North Korea and things like that? Yeah, so that's the other impact. And I wanted to kind of hit this head on. We'll bring it up during the discussion as well. But I wanted to bring this, head on for everyone. One of the angles, if you will, that we did not explore as I'm not going to say as well as, but I want to say our primary angle was not when an APT threat actor is using ransomware as their vehicle and that kind of stuff. I think it's important to point out. I want to know if you're running an organization or you're the CISO or the head of security or, information security manager, things like that. How do you change your business and change your approach based on ransomware, a potential incident? Number one. Number two, what does that attack look like when it comes to an organization? We've got 3 case studies we're going to look at as well. My point being this, we've got lots of examples about the impact of ransomware. We're not going to spend all our time focusing on the threat groups that use it. I think we want to look more at the business operations, the business side of things. But that being said, we'll come back and talk about threat groups because we've got some that, use ransomware as their primary vehicle. So with that said, again, Matt Bromley over here in the SANS team, Kevin over at Vectra, thanks for joining me. Folks, let's go ahead and get started now that we know what this is going to look like. And we'll move right into it. I don't need to repeat this. I think this line has probably been said on multiple webcasts before. We know that ransomware is one of the largest and most prolific threats facing organizations out there today. But the key difference that I wanted to highlight, and as someone who spent many years in incident response, I feel like it's important to understand that parallel for anyone who may be in an IR role or in a SOC role, and maybe those junior analyst roles who are just getting started out. It's important to understand that some of the biggest incidents years ago, decades ago, a decade ago, 2 decades, however long some of us have been in this industry, incidents back then, you might have, hey, we discovered a threat actor in our environment. That threat actor has, taken multiple gigabytes of data out of here, but half this data is protected IP or it's classified information or it's something that we really can't go out there and announce other than we've had a data breach. For anyone who remembers kind of those credit card payment frauds or credit card data thefts, those were perhaps some of the most public data breaches that we had for quite a while. Is we had announcements of credit card data being stolen. And then we've also got, like if you think back to the Equifax hack and things like that, where we see that PCI data stolen. Long story short, it was usually some sort of a regulated data pressure that forced the spotlight on an organization. I will not ever name names about this, but I will say very confidently that a lot of data breaches are footnotes on a 10K. And it's just kind of, that's where it sits. And it was a somewhat manageable industry because we reacted to it, we responded, we remediated, contained, moved on, and hoped they didn't come back. Ransomware seems to step outside of all of that. Number one, it is not a data theft necessarily, or just a data theft. Let's keep in mind, it is data theft, extortion, fund allocation. Ransomware actors have no problems sending screenshots, publicly harassing, embarrassing organizations, shaming people into their security practices, starting forums, spreading notes out, giving access to other threat actors. That used to be a big no-no amongst threat actors. I've seen environments where threat actors would battle and kick each other out because of the data that was in there. It wasn't this sort of like, oh, tell you what, you get the East, I'll get the West, and we'll both collect money. We'll be good to go. So it creates a very, very different type of breach for an organization. Now, one of the things we focused on as we kind of pulled this paper together was, imagine you're an organization who for 20 years, 15 years, built your security posture, your security policy around, if someone takes our IP, we're going to have to contain, we're going to have to respond, we're going to have to remediate, we're going to have to recover, and then move right back into kind of that monitoring stage, right? Your IR plan is written around the ability to control the message. Your IR plan is written around, well, we can define the scope. our threat actors are going to be very quiet. They're silent about this. Flip all of that around. Your threat actor is loud and noisy in the environment. They're quick. They're fast. Their breaches take an hour or two. Some of my favorite blog posts out there are the ones on the DFIR report that talks about ransomware threat actors going from 0 to domain admin in 45 minutes or an hour, a very, very short period of time. That changes, I think, really the scope of what organizations probably built into their IR plan. So that's maybe impact number one. Impact number two is obviously the money side of it as well. And I've got a few examples that I've dropped in here, and I put them at a weird angle just to make you kind of, crook your neck as you look at the screen. But there was a Unit 42 ransomware threat report that showed payments climbing to the average payment climbing to a record 570,000 in the first half of 2021. But then we also get this little one right here, an insurer made, and they call out certain segments. I won't name names. Maybe I don't know who, maybe I do, doesn't matter. An insurer made a $40 million ransom payment to regain control of its systems. I think it's worth calling out. This is potential impact number two. So if potential impact number one was turning an IR policy upside down because they weren't structured for this type of incident, I think impact number two is, folks, for a lot of organizations out there, this is pretty serious money. I know for a lot of organizations out there, some of this is board level approval money, if not at least, C-suite, executive decision money and that kind of stuff. So that's perhaps one of the other impacts is we're not talking about a sum that I don't think anyone does this, but can be kind of swept into a budget or can be built in as, hey, let's anticipate $1 million in ransomware losses. And in case we don't use it, we'll just burn it on something else, right? That's not the way it works. It is very much so a ton of money. And the other thing that I'll point out, which I've always been really interested in, is how the threat actors do their homework when it comes to demanding money. I dropped in here, a third example of a tech company being hit with a $50 million extortion attempt, warning that they double the ransom if it wasn't paid quickly. There's another example I like to mention. Not sure this would necessarily be a G2K, but more of a focus of like tactics when it comes to finance. There was a school district in Florida, I think a year or two ago, they got hit. Kevin, you and I might have talked about this too, but there was a school district that got hit and they demanded a ridiculous sum, like 40 million or something like that. And the school district came back and was like, are you kidding? We're a school district. We have no way of paying this money. And they came back, the attackers did, and they said, we've seen your finances. It's 1% of your annual operating budget. We just want 1%. And I've discussed this before. I find that to be a really interesting tactic to come to the table, because when you think about kind of business negotiations, and if everyone puts on their Shark Tank hat for a moment, right? Those are the types of conversations you see happen back and forth. Well, hey, I want 1%. I'll give you 2. Here's this valuation. Here's this, here's that. Ransomware authors coming to or actors coming to the table with, I made a demand. My demand is based on these economics and these calculations and these finances. Here's what I know you have. I've extorted I've exfiltrated all of your accounting data, so I know what your balances look like. Here's what I'd like for you to do for me. And it's this really weird back and forth of like, wow, this has now become a granted illegal, but still a business negotiation involving quite a lot of money in this case. And then the other, kind of reminder, or the other side of this, I gave you all a little bit of a precursor at the beginning that said, Kevin and I are not going to spend our time talking about threat actors who use ransomware. We're going to talk about the business impact of ransomware on them. But I find that very often organizations look at threat actors as their primary focus point. For a long time, and I will say this has started to shift perhaps over the past year or so, or maybe past couple of years. But I will say for a long time, there was always this kind of question of like, hey, who's coming after us? What types of threat actors should we be worried about? Well, you're in such and such industry, so you should look out for this threat actor, that, so on and so forth. Ransomware is an objective. Ransomware is a threat objective. It is something that a one-time script kiddie can deploy. It is something that a ransomware as a service, well-seasoned group of veterans can deploy. It is something that a APT level state nexus group can deploy. It is, one of those threats that straddles pretty much every single type of threat actor that can be out there. And that, to me, makes it something that just cannot be ignored. And if your organization is in a place where ransomware just gets roped in with all these other threats, I think you're doing yourself a little bit of a disservice from a preparedness perspective. So with that said, we've got 3 case studies here that I think focus on 3 G2K companies, and these are publicly known. So if anyone's watching this and you work at any of these organizations, we pulled all this data from public sources. None of this is, private IR reports or anything like that. But we wanted to take a look at, beyond just the financial side of things, beyond the security posturing side of things, what other impacts do we see from a ransomware perspective? The first one I called out in the paper was an impact on client trust. Now, this is not to say, everyone watching, that the impacts I've defined are long-term or irreversible, if you will. It's more of the initial question that pops up when that data breach gets announced. And client trust is the first one I picked up on. And this involved the ransomware attack on Accenture. Again, publicly known, well done, in August 2021. A ransomware attack that stole proprietary data and, in my opinion, created a double-headed threat. First off, the company itself has to recover from this incident. That is just incident response 101. We've been breached. Someone found a way in. We got to, detect, identify, contain, remediate, so on and so forth. They got to move on. But I feel like there's a secondary question that comes out of that. When you're the custodian of other people's data, the second question that comes out is, can the adversary use this data to harm us, or did they steal something that could be used to harm our customers? This also can sometimes factor into that supply chain concern. I've seen this happen where someone's supplier gets ransomed and they start to wonder what their own data risk is based on integrations and connections into their environment. But I think when you have a big kind of data custodian company, and again, not diving into the various parts of Accenture that may have been compromised, more of the idea that they offer consulting services, they've got custodian data, I think they've got some managed services as well. The goal there is to focus on triaging quickly, because the longer this breach extends out, the more data gets leaked, the more customer trust starts to decrease, and the more longer term impact you have. And I'll say, as someone who sat on both sides of this coin, I've worked with organizations who have been ransomed. And sometimes these conversations start off with, are you gonna get hit again? I'm not putting my data with you if you're getting hit again. And it's like, well, geez, how do we go about answering that question? And then I've seen the other side, which is, yeah, it happens to everyone. It's okay. So customer trust is a finicky thing. But I think this is maybe the first impact, not the first, but the first case study that can impact how customers view your organization, view the safety of their data at your organization. I think that's a pretty important one too, especially if that's your business. The second one we called out, we just had to go here because it was a very important thing to announce as well, was the impact on the global supply chain. And this is where a ransomware attack starts to become kinetic. And I've seen lots of descriptions and lots of folks talk about that kind of cyber kinetic effect. I'm a big fan of that word. I like that combination right there. It makes me feel like I'm, filming Terminator or something like that. But I like the idea of, let's explore the impact when ransomware jumps beyond the ones and zeros, if you will. JBS USA, again, May 2021. 2021 was a busy year for a lot of folks. Might have been something to do with the price of crypto. I don't know, but we'll see. Ransomware attack that halted production at 5 production facilities in the US and extended to Australia as well. So based on the way, well, I'm going to say potentially based on the way the computer networks were set up, or based on the way the attack unfolded or attacks unfolded, we saw cross-continental impact from a supply chain perspective. Couple of things here that bring up. Number one, if I am a provider, a food provider, if you will, or anywhere a link in the supply chain, that any disruption is going to cause an issue from a competitive perspective. If I can no longer fulfill the orders that I'm being asked to fulfill, someone's going to have to pick up that slack. It's going to be one of my competitors who's going to grab it, because my ultimate customers, if you will, are not going to go pop up a farm really quick and grow the things that they need until I can get back on my feet. Now, I will say we've all, I think, at least in the United States, have experienced pretty big supply chain issues where stores are just out of things. I don't think that's all ransomware, but we've seen what it's like when supply chains get pushed to their limit. We're just out of things. Things just aren't there. Ransomware attacks that cause this are impacting a very extensive supply chain, a massive supply chain, and it's very costly because not only are you spending money to recover from that incident, you're also not fulfilling those customer orders. In fact, you might even be giving money back to help keep those customers on board with you. And I feel like, the other impact that we see organizations suffer from is, hey, this is not just, a cyber attack where the security team comes in, does their investigation, issues a report, we plug the holes, and we're, business as usual never stops. This was a very costly revenue per day measured ransomware attack. That's going to change how you approach security in the future, in my opinion. I think that's going to change some of the things that we're going to see. The last one I picked up on was Brenntag. I might be mispronouncing that, but this one is an impact to data integrity and extortion, in my opinion. And this is, again, something that the G2K should be considering as they take a look at, something that the G2K should be looking at as they consider what ransomware can do to their environments. So again, May 2021, we're still in, last year, lots of successful ransomware for organizations here. May 2021, DarkSide ransomware compromised the North American division. That's also an interesting thing. There's an interesting outlay there when it comes to a security perspective or a corporate security or an enterprise security perspective. When someone goes after a certain continent of yours or a certain network in a certain continent, that can, potentially have impacts on the way you structure a network. But the big kicker here is what was stolen. 150 gigs of files from the environment. Ransomware authors claim that they had included contracts, NDAs, and chemical formulas in there as well. I will be the first person to say, and if a ransomware attacker ever sees this and decides to hold it against me, I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But the amount of NDAs that get signed during prospecting, customer discussions, information sharing, things like that, the amount of data that gets shared under that protective document, having that potentially fall into the wrong hands, or even someone knowing that you had entered an NDA with an organization can sometimes be very, very damaging, because it does indicate, hey, this communication was once here. But contracts and chemical formulas, I mean, if true, if that's stolen and whatnot, that can also be very, very damaging because what may have been a proprietary competitive advantage for that organization is no longer there. Furthermore, kind of compromises your ability to say no one else has ever looked at this. No one else has ever figured out what our process looks like or what this chemical compound looks like. And now they do. Now they know. And it's funny. I'll give a brief little story here, but I remember working with an organization once that had a ton of IP. A technology manufacturer, very, very sensitive organization, produced a lot of products that would not be known to others, but is in pretty much everywhere. And we talked once about if their data had been stolen, had someone stole your blueprints, what would that look like to you as an organization? Just an FYI, they are in the Fortune 50. I'll just mention that. And their response was, without our manufacturing equipment, the blueprints are useless. That was where they had taken their level of understanding their risk to, was there's only so much we can do to protect this data, but you would need to literally take over our plant in a secret location in order to be able to actually manufacture these things. There's no other way you could manufacture them without spending way too much money to reverse engineer this process. But think about that. Think about the impact that had on the organization. The security team had to analyze and had to come up with that risk assessment and someone had to make that executive decision in order to be that confident about it. And I think, again, it's another big impact for organizations of this size is, hey, we have a competitive advantage. That's what earns our money. That's what keeps our customers. That's what keeps us in play. Our customers trust us. Our ability to provide or be part of that supply chain is what keeps us alive. We're running on razor thin margins as it is, or we're not running on razor thin margins. All of these decision points all of these different business considerations have to go into how we respond to ransomware now. And like I said, 10 years ago, I don't think that was that much of the case when it came to certain types of cyber attacks. So I think we've seen a huge impact from ransomware, just in the sense of I can map out how multiple organizations could suffer this impact. And I'll just add in Brentags was but had a $7.5 million demand. Again, out of a $14.2 billion market cap. Again, folks, that's a tactic of ransomware attackers, studying financials, understanding how much money they've potentially got. I mean, shoot, cash balances are announced if the company's public, right? So they walk in and say, hey, here's what I want. I know how much you have in the bank. I know what this data means to you. Good Lord, I've got your contracts. I have a very good idea of what this may mean to you. Here's the demand that I'm making. Business has got to respond to that. So that's our third of 3 case studies. Again, let me just recap a couple of points because I'm going to jump into a quick discussion with Kevin now. But I wanted to, again, highlight that it's not just a cyber attack that a lot of us just read about and maybe perhaps help respond to or deal with or provide products to protect or defend against. It is changing business processes. It is changing security postures and security stacks. It is a very impactful type of attack. And I want to make sure that we captured that. And I think we did a good job of pointing out, hey, there's a lot of ways that this type of attack can impact your organization. Be prepared for it and be ready, because I really hope to never have someone up here as their own case study, or at least have you watching from this point. So that being said, Kevin, that's my little digression / dissertation. How are you doing, sir? What do you think of the paper so far? Let me start out with, what do you think of the paper so far?
Matt, I love the paper. I think you did a wonderful job in capturing just the some of the main ways that this impacts businesses, and really captured this is a business decision, and that's a business on the ransomware actor side. It's also a business decision as organizations think about how to deal with this, both really understanding the threat model and thinking through all of the implications, whether it's what is going to be the impact to our ability to generate revenue, our credibility in the market, our legal and liability exposures. This is a very complex issue to think through. And there's the technical side of this, and I think we'll talk some of the technical pieces, but also just in thinking through your plan. There are so many business implications now. It really is a holistic look at this to understand what are you going to do about this threat.
Yeah, agreed. It's a good succinct way to phrase it. And I think it's interesting because I think there's a lot of discussions out there where the security team may not, or not discussions, but there's a lot of organizations where the security team may not realize how much of an influence they can actually have on that discussion. But something like ransomware, I'm not going to call it an equalizer, but I feel like it's a really interesting discussion where you might have C-suite members, not stepping down, but more like reaching down through the depths of the security team. Like, hey, what are your thoughts on this? I've heard plenty of organizations who I think maybe 5-6 years ago, Kevin I would be talking with them. They weren't asking me questions about visibility and coverage and things like that. They weren't asking questions like that. It was more like, hey, are the boxes checked? Are we compliant? Great. Now we've got, hey, here's my crown jewels, or if you will, or here's the data that if this got out would impact me the most. What's my visibility there? Can I prioritize this over that? And it's these business decisions that maybe we were always going to arrive at, but maybe we just got here faster because of ransomware. But nonetheless, I think our first question, which we've kind of already been dancing around a little bit, how do ransomware actor exploitation times influence security? And I'm guessing what was really meant by this was how quickly an adversary can get into an organization and go from 0 to DA or 1 to many systems and things like that. In your opinion, your thoughts, how do you think these quick times or these rapid exploitation times impact or influence how a security team does what they do?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of components to this, but one of the things that the threat actors have gotten very good at is going from some new exploit drops, there's a POC, and they very quickly turn that into, at scale, scanning to find anyone who's exposed. And there's so much out there, whether it's, hitting VPNs, VoIP, like there's just so much that they're very quickly putting on high-speed scan. If you have any exposure, they're going to find it fast. And then, the other piece of this is, as you pointed out, this is multi-billion-dollar industry. There's the capability to develop novel ODAs that are not yet disclosed. No patches exist. And so I think, there's always, doing the basics right is hugely helpful. And so things like patch management, yeah, you should do those well. But I think the speed here of taking advantage of new exploits always creates this race condition that you can't really count. Even if you're very good at the basics and you're very good at patch management, you still have to assume that they've gotten in, that they were faster than you. And so that shifts the fundamental mentality in security to assume compromise. Now what? So as you build your ransomware plan, if they got through, if they're inside, whether that's in my cloud or the webcast you did a couple of weeks ago, or it's in my data center, like what do I do? How do I find them? How do I build resilience into the business and have a plan for that? Versus always thinking by doing the basics, I can just keep them out and raise the bar high enough that no one's ever going to get in.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to phrase it. I also think about the SANS. I don't have it up here. Maybe I'll drop a link in the chat, but I think about that SANS 6-step incident response process. And maybe I gave a preview of this earlier on in this webcast. But I think about, organizations that maybe are used to a little more time in between, maybe, and we run plenty of reports and surveys where we conduct those kind of average dwell times, and Verizon DBIR talks about it. Various industry reports talk about those dwell times of how long an organization or how long a threat actor sits in an organization before they're detected. If I'm basing metrics around a lot of those, I'm not going to notice the threat actor until the ransom note drops, which, as I've said before publicly, if that is your detection, you're way too late in the game, in my opinion, number one. Number two, I think it's very valid as well to point out, and I know you got to this as well, but it's very valid to point out, what those processes look like, what are the timings of those processes, but then more importantly too, as an organization, are we testing those? Are we putting those in place? And it's a fair question, I think, to say, hey, here's this technology we've got in place. Are we testing and validating that this thing actually does what it says it's going to do? Are we seeing that kind of quick turnaround that we've expected? Are we seeing that, intra-second or intra-minute, intra-hour detection that we need in order to defend against this? And I like the idea of setting that bar. I want to go find the worst ransomware report I can that's publicly available and say, all right, here's the bar. Here's the bar. How do we build barriers that raise this time to actually a manageable point for us? And I like that approach of building something that no one can get in, or we just unplug everything and then problem solved. All right, that actually leads right into kind of our next question, and I kind of covered this one as well. But how do ransomware actor dwell times influence security? And that's that, again, for everyone here, that length of time that an adversary is in the environment from entry until first detection. This metric has been sometimes measured in months and years, thinking back to some of the earlier state of cybersecurity reports from back in the day. And sometimes it's measured in days and hours as we've moved more, towards a more mature state. But I feel like we've covered that kind of 6-step incident response process really suffers if you have to accelerate through a bunch of the different phases because of the impact of a ransomware attack that's coming on board. But let me ask you maybe another side of this too, Kevin, from a security perspective, maybe from a control validation perspective, or maybe from a, hey, we need technology that does this and that perspective. Should dwell times be some sort of a barometer that an organization could use? Is it fair to say, hey, I need to be able to detect within 10 minutes or else I'm going to, my organization's going to suffer? Do you think it's fair to put that question out there, or is that too much of an ask for a lot of teams to keep up with?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, it's interesting because you talked about the stats, and one of the things you see is the dwell time. The average dwell time has come down, and a big part of that is when you have an attack. I think ransomware, the average dwell time is 4 days, and you learn because the note drops, and so it's not necessarily whether you do anything or not. And so that's brought the overall stats down quite a bit. But we have seen a wide variety depending on the internal controls. So, if you think about just the hard crunchy exterior and you're relying on that, then you mentioned the case of 45 minutes from entry to domain admin. That probably means the internal controls weren't so great. And so as you get better internal controls, and you can test that through red teaming and doing those sorts of things, to say, how long is it going to take? How long do we have? Because the more that you can invest in controls, the more you're going to buy yourself time to be able to see and respond. That being said, yeah, it's absolutely critical to be able to measure your time to detect, but also to respond, because detecting alone isn't enough. If you can't respond to the threat and stop it, then which is going to put tests on your operational processes, your automation, do you have 24/7 coverage, all that sort of stuff really factors in. And so that should be a key metric for the security team as you think about reducing risk. The more you can bring that time to detect and time to respond to the threats that matter, whether that's the threat profile, whether that's the threat actor, threat objective, like really thinking through what that is, the things you care about, red teaming, doing other testing. If you can detect and respond to that faster, your risk is much lower. So that absolutely should be a KPI, both for ransomware and for other types of threats.
Yeah, 100%. I well put, well said. I like that. I like looking at that metric, and I like using those numbers. Security teams out there listening, make sure you're reading up on these external reports and these kind of case studies. And, when these blog posts and things come out, make sure you're reading up. And one thing I tell a lot of folks to do when we put white papers or surveys together is compare the results of our surveys towards your environment if you weren't one of our respondents. And I think there's a really good barometer out there for, hey, this is what has been seeing in other organizations. Perhaps this is another impact of ransomware as well. Kevin, I'm sure you've been in a lot of these discussions. I can remember for a while hearing from folks like, well, what are my competitors doing? What are other folks in my industry doing? And using that as some sort of a bellwether of like, well, everyone else in my industry only has one firewall, so I'll get two, therefore I'm better than everyone, right? And it's like, no, it comes down to your internal controls, how they're configured, how they're set up. I've been in some multi-billion-dollar environments with 2 ingress egress points. I've been in small multi-million-dollar environments that have 20. And it's kind of like wherever your controls are, that's what that attack surface is going to look like, number one. And it's also going to dictate just what that security response is going to look like for you as well. So with that said, the other thing that we kind of explored a little bit in the paper was we talked about incident response plans, including non-security teams. And I'll give a quick precursor, and then Kevin, I really want to get your thoughts on this more, because I know this is something that I think you've got a good handle on as well. But the genesis of this came from, if y'all remember back to that slide a little bit ago, where we talked about the impact of ransomware hitting, the public naming and shaming, the extortion, potential data integrity data integrity complications, data release, so on and so forth. And that led us down this path of like, well, should an IR plan include more than just non-security teams? And when I say non-security teams, folks, I don't mean also include in-house counsel and stuff like that. I mean, like, should our PR team, because remember, we're talking about the G2000 here. We're not talking about someone who doesn't afford these. We're talking about folks who have massive marketing departments, and they have PR teams and public representations and internal and external counsel and things like that. So my question, Kevin, I'll let you tackle this one. I'm happy to add on, was, should our IR plan start to include these non-security teams for these types of breaches?
Oh, it absolutely has to. These are business decisions. And I think the security team has an absolutely critical role to play in helping the decision makers determine what the right path is. But when you think about these, and there's so many concerns and things to think through, from the reputation of the business. What was the data that was stolen? What's the impact if that is released? Is that going to impact our customer trust? You talked about that in the Accenture case study. Like, what's that going to do to our core brand and the trust our customers put in us? There's legal implications around, is this threat actor under sanction and paying could create legal liability for, the CEO or, some other exec. And then they're asking for $40 million, and that's a substantive port. Like, someone from the C-suite is going to be absolutely involved in making that decision.
Mhm.
I'll tell you one of the really interesting things. Like, we are in this space. We talk to a lot of companies who are either, looking at us as they figure out what they do to up their game post one of these, or, we've been with them during one of the events and working on stopping and evicting. Still, one of the most impactful things for us was we went through, as a company, a simulation, or a tabletop, where we brought in the executive team and the technical team and went through a variety of scenarios around this. And man, it's eye-opening when they say, if they got this data, what would you do? If they got this data, here's the thing that you learn. And you realize just how complex and multifaceted this decision is.
Mhm.
So I think it's critical to bring all of those people into the tent and plan it out, and have your game plan before, have the right firms retained to think through, to be your negotiators, all of that, because you got to plan for the worst case. I do think one of the, if you look at some of the case studies, even that were in the paper, one of the things that always comes up, especially in the extortion case, is, what do they really have? And this is where the act, in terms of data, and one of the things that you'll see the threat actors do is they'll sometimes try to bluff and overplay their hand. I give you this little piece, and I'm going to tell you I have all of this. And there's a big difference between, I have a couple of records, or I have something that indicates I could be in here, and I have it all, in
Mhm.
terms of how what that does for your exposure and decisions. So even to be able to say definitively, what do they have, is a really, really important thing. And that requires a lot of visibility into how data is moving, and where they got and what access they had. And that's something that the security team needs to think through and feed into that incident response activity.
Yeah, no, agreed 100%. I really don't have much else to add. I think you covered that one in such good depth. The other thing I'll maybe add on, for a kind of involvement exercise, if you will, I think Kevin listed out a bunch of different groups that are important to have on hand and things like that. I'd maybe ask or challenge our attendees, those of you that do get into like those tabletop exercises, or you get a chance to kind of walk through what our organization would look like if we're responding to a ransomware incident, that kind of stuff. This may sound a little bit silly, but if you've got non-security teams in that IR plan, involve them in that tabletop exercise as well. It may sound a little weird, right, to have some of those non-security folks show up to a tabletop. Everyone's just kind of standing around wondering what they're doing and things like that. But I'll give a quick anecdote here, or a quick analogy that worked out very, very well. I did a tabletop exercise a few years ago with an organization over on the West Coast of the US. And they had a line item, which was, they had two key data centers, and they had a line item which said, if ransomware threat actor got into one, kill the line that connected the two. So that way, one of the data centers was still protected, assuming the adversary hadn't already got over there. So during the tabletop exercise we were running, someone just kind of threw out that bullet point, like, oh yeah, we'd cut the connection between these two. And everyone kind of paused there for a moment. And it was like, well, hold on a second. How do we cut the connection between these two? 2 hours later, the 14 of us are still sitting around this table trying to figure out what that process looks like. Now, I'm super glad we had the tabletop exercise to figure this out. but it involved calling up a facilities personnel. It involved getting a hold of some of the network engineering team. It involved getting a hold of someone who was in the wrong org chart and didn't know they had responsibilities that they were responsible for. I mean, it turned into this whole massive thing that, quite frankly, you would not want to be doing if you are under a ransomware attack, or you had, someone like myself or Kevin sitting there saying, hey, we need to go do this now. And they're like, I don't even know where to start with that one. Let's shift a little bit, Kevin. Let's shift our discussion over to entry vectors, or common ransomware entry vectors, if you will, TTPs. I saw this question come up a few times. I've had this asked to me by certain C-suite members in certain organizations. I threw this out. It's a little bit cheeky, but I think it's a good question. Why don't we just disable some of these common entry vectors? I mean, if I'm reading reports that say that, RDP is one of the primary entry mechanisms, well, why don't I just go disable RDP across the board? I mean, I'm a G2K. We're not using this type of technology anymore, right? Is it necessary? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you can shut down attack surface and close attack surface, that's always good. So our RDP, if you have it exposed to the internet and you don't absolutely need it, you can find a better way. Man, it's going to reduce your exposure, because there's so many vulns that pop up in that, and you're going to constantly be worried about whether that's getting popped. That being said, in many cases, you can't shut it off. There's some business critical need that's there, or it's your VPN. Are you going to shut your VPN off? That gets attacked all the time. Your VoIP, like, that's getting attacked all the time. Like, if you need it to run the business, Azure AD, right? That's getting attacked in different ways, and you can turn on MFA, but that's a partial solution, and you can't shut off Azure AD, because that's federating for many organizations. That's federating everything to get their employees into their VPN, their zero trust gateway, into their SaaS apps. I mean, it's the linchpin, and that's what the attackers are really good at taking advantage of. You need those to run your business. You can't shut them off. They're hard to defend and secure entirely. And so those have become the entry points. So yeah, it's
tough.
That's one of the challenges.
It is. It's really tough to just try and just shut it all down. And I think you hit the nail on the head, at least the one that I was going to make sure I bring up as well. There's always some sort of business need. There's always some sort of pre-approved requirement or something like that in most cases. And sometimes, there was a developer or an admin or someone who, I won't say they got lazy, but let's just say they could have been more careful. And, something was accidentally left open or left turned on that shouldn't have been, or an adversary went in and turned it on and just had a way to get around it. I would say, again, I've issued the same advice that I've issued on previous questions or previous discussion points here. Read those intel reports, read those dissections of attacks, read the upcoming trends, read the DBIRs and the industry reports and all that. And folks, if there's a top 10 list in there, take the top three and stack them up against your environment and give yourself that coverage. Because the one thing I've seen, especially as a survey author, when InfoSec surveys and, case studies come out, there's always this, it's not a bell curve. It's always a massive distribution of, like, I think back to the DBIR report. I think it's like 79% or 80% or something like that of breaches involve the human element and that kind of stuff. And I'm like, cool. So if I can secure all my systems down, I've only covered 20% of statistics, so focus on the top three and maybe try to find some wins in there as well. Last little discussion question before I bring this up, Kevin, I'll let you read through this one, but we've got a few questions that have come in. Before we get to maybe our discussion point here, I want to take some time to address that. And I know you've got some things lined up for us as well. First question that came in was, will we ever get to a point where cyber insurance doesn't reward an attacker and instead helps an organization proactively protect their environment from an attack? This one came in a little bit ago, probably when I was in the middle of talking about some of the case studies. I will throw my own insight here. I have seen cyber insurers kind of raise the bar for organizations. There is kind of like I think it used to be just, come one, come all, but now there's a lot of, unless you meet these minimum requirements, we will not insure you and things like that. I view that as an interestingly forced way of, hey, we need you at a minimum level before we'll insure you. But I do like the fact that, someone who maybe wanted insurance couldn't have had it 2 months ago, but they can have it now. Kevin, any thoughts on the cyber insurance side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is raising the bar, and that helps because it gives the security team more ammo to go and say we need we need this investment. They also do give credits for certain types of, if you have this or you have this, you'll get a lower rate, even if you're above the bar. And so that helps to increase it. But I mean, the question at the core of that is, if they're getting paid, they're going to keep doing it. It's going to fund more. And it's just such a difficult thing. And it's easy to make it, a black and white decision until you do the tabletops and you start to get into this point where it's like, it's actually pretty hard. I don't know if it's a cyber insurance problem. We have to get to a point where the business case doesn't make it worthwhile for the threat actors. That's the only way this goes away.
Yeah, 100%. I think another one that is worth mentioning too is, if you're, I would say cyber insurance is definitely an applicable topic for the G2K, 100%. And I think also, you've got this kind of interesting market in the cyber insurance thing, because you're essentially, as an organization, saying to yourself, hey, I'm anticipating this attack, or I'm anticipating, that we may suffer this attack. So I'm going to try to insure myself against this, which for me is already an interesting start. Now, there's probably a lot of folks out there who may be like, yeah, but they're just trying to buy their way out of having to do any security things. And I would argue and say, well, at least they're considering and trying to find a way out of it. They're at least having that discussion of, hey, we think this thing is coming down the line. How do we kind of work around that? That conversation may not have been happening a year ago. So I'd say any movement in that direction is a good one. One other question, we did start talking a little bit about non-security parties being involved in incident response plans and things like that. Another question that came in said, how should enterprises handling communications with partners that have been impacted by ransomware? What would you expect from a third party, to feel they address the ransomware, so on and so forth? Look, I do not know the terms and the small fine print of every single partner agreement out there. I do know recently I've seen the fine print of some partner agreements that do mention, if you are compromised, if we are compromised, certain terms are laid out and stuff like that. But I would say for anyone in that G2K space, you've got to protect your own network. If a supply chain provider or a third party has a hook into your environment and they get compromised, I would expect as much transparency as your security team needs to make sure you are not involved in that. That's my personal, opinion on that. If that means security team A and security team B all fall under NDA and go have a serious discussion inside of a boardroom that never, makes it outside of whatever, that's one thing. But I think, you as someone who has a connection to that third party, you need as much information as you need to feel confident that, you have not been compromised or not been a result of this as well. I view that's the best the supplier can do for you. Every security team's got to determine that on their own, right? It's going to depend on your own security stack. Kevin, I'll let you, take a stab at that answer as well. And then I'm actually going to hand it right over to you to kind of talk about some of the other things you've got lined up for us as well. But I'll let you start off with kind of addressing that question.
Sure. We can, if we can go back on the slide.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I think I accidentally hit
it. Yeah. Lots of color there.
Yes, there we go.
So I'll cheat a little bit. I think the one thing that really should be top of mind, we've hit on this many times, is if you shift the mentality to assume compromise, assume that there is an adversary, ransomware adversary already inside, implement the plan, the response plan, do the plan for full business resiliency from that point forward. So, thinking through your detection response capabilities, your recovery capabilities, your incident response tabletops, and what you would do in the heat with all of those components. You really have to build the plan for business resiliency once the adversary is inside. And so that's the a little bit more than one thing, but we'll call it one thing.
Gotcha. All right. I like it. Very, very good. All right. I will hand it over to you then, Kevin. I know you've got some stuff lined up for us, so please feel free to take it away.
Yeah, sure. So, I think one of the things that we've been talking a lot about is, the adversary being able to get inside, to exploit the attack surface that you have to leave open in order to run the business. One of the real challenges is the unknown. And so if you think about it, how confident would you be right now to say whether there's a ransomware adversary or supply chain attack or a nation state that's somewhere in your organization. And we did a survey on this recently, and about 3/4 of organizations don't feel very confident that they would know. And so this unknown is a huge challenge, but it's really not surprising when you think about how much the attack surface has expanded. And so that includes not just the endpoints and the data center and the physical networks that many of us are most comfortable with, but it includes, a bunch of different SaaS applications. It includes AWS, Azure, GCP in some mix. It has this whole identity framework that is now exposed to the internet, commonly with an Azure Active Directory or similar federated identity that kind of ties it all together. So there's this massive attack surface. Much of it is new and novel, which means there are also novel ways of attacking it, different methods that are still new. They're not well understood by most teams. And then you tie that all together and say, at the same time, there's this shortage of people and it's challenging to hire and retain. So who is building detection capabilities, looking at alerts? Do you have the automation, all of the pieces to tie it together? All of that creates this real challenge of the unknown and not being able to answer that question with confidence. And so really that's why Vectra exists. That's our core charter, and what we help our customers with is being able to look across this attack surface and whether, I think the webinar you did a couple of weeks ago on the cloud native ransomware was super interesting about how the cloud can be turned on itself to implement ransomware attacks. So whether it's in your cloud and your AWS, it's Risky Business did a great blurb a couple of weeks ago about using on that podcast. If you don't listen to it, you should. It's fantastic. But about M365 and using some controlling the versions on files and then overriding to basically ransom everything that's in M365, or it's in your data center. There's so many ways in. There's so many places for the attacker to hide. What we do is look across all of that and give you attack signal intelligence. If you think of threat intel as the known and all the stuff that is known, attack signal intelligence is for the unknown. That is coverage, the insight and clarity with prioritization, and then tying it all together into your workflows, your tools, your automation, and providing a managed offering to complement or supplement your team. And then we tie that all together. We do the network identity SaaS public cloud. We tie together with endpoints so that where there is an agent available, then we can also bring in that context. And just the platform that we deliver is pulling a variety of data sources. So it's networks in all forms, whether those are in the cloud, virtual data center, physical data center, logs from public cloud like AWS, CloudTrail, SaaS applications like Microsoft 365, and looking at all of the native functionality within that, from Power Automate to Teams to SharePoint to Exchange, identity, Active Directory, Azure AD, tie that all together, detect, prioritize across it, and then give you the tools to investigate and respond quickly, tying into your existing tools, workflows, as well as enforcement points like the EDR or a NAC or a firewall, so that you basically are building the intelligence in to help stop once things have been detected. And we do use AI. AI is everyone talks about AI. I'm not going to say a ton here. It is our North Star. We do a very different approach than you will typically see with simple anomalies that are saying, here, I'm going to show you what's different, which especially for large enterprises is incredibly noisy and gets a bad rap for being incredibly noisy, rightly so. and also misses a lot of interesting attack signal because attackers are pretty good at blending in. We've taken a fundamentally different approach that's looking at the methods, the countermeasures, very aligned with MITRE, and then bring in the data scientists to say what's the right tool and the toolkit to use for this. That gives a much better signal. It's at the heart of all that we do. Specific to ransomware, I'd encourage you, if that sounds interesting, go to vectra.ai/ransomware, and you'll see more about how the platform can help with this challenge. There's case studies, demos, testimonials, a bunch of things to help you better understand if we could be a fit in your security plans.
Awesome. Kevin, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining me today. Appreciate you being able to share all that with us as well. And a huge thanks over to the team at Vectra, Kevin included, obviously, for helping us come together on a really cool spotlight paper and talking about the impact of ransomware, again, on just some of the largest organizations out there. A lot of good lessons learned, a lot of good case studies, a lot of examinations. I hope everyone was able to think about, how does my own organization kind of play and how have we been impacted by this? And are there any future steps, anything else we need to do? With that said, we are right at time. Kevin, again, thank you for joining me today. Carol, I'm going to hand it over to you to take us home, but a huge thanks to everyone who joined us wherever you are in the world. It was great sharing some time with you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt and Kevin, for your great presentation, and to Vectra for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.